Hi everyone, welcome to Impact Training, to the very first one of this semester. Super excited that you're here. A little bit about myself, if I have not met you, my name is Putti. This is my 7th year here on staff. I was a student here, came to UTA as an atheist, and so I did not have very much productive knowledge about Christianity. And I was not just an atheist, I was like an ardent atheist. I was super excited about being atheist. I remember walking through my dorm, I lived in Lipscomb, and I had a guy stop me. His name's Andy, and he invited me to Vertical. It used to be called Wide Awake. And I remember telling him, like, no, thank you, I'm an atheist. And he was like, atheists are allowed to, come to Bible study. And I was like, really? I didn't know that. And so I came the next week to Wide Awake, and I just came because I was super social, still am, and I just liked being around friends, and if they were going to Bible study, I was going to Bible study. If they were praying, I'd sit and watch them pray. And they're super interesting to me because they would go door to door, invite people to Vertical, Wide Awake, invite people to Bible study. They pray for people. They were just doing all these radical things. They were like asking people if they could like clean their bathrooms, and they're like, yeah, we love God and we just want to serve you. And I was like, wow, that's really radical, that's really cool. And I was just the atheist girl who kind of like followed them around and like served with them. And so that was really interesting. Fast forward, still like a year later, I would have said like there's no way I would ever become a Christian. And this is after going to Bible study Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock here, and then going to Bible study at a local church with friends, and then going to church on Sundays. Again, I did it mainly because I just wanted to be around friends, and I really enjoyed hanging out with them. But I became more and more curious, and it was that second year when I remember praying in my room, God, if you're really the God of the Bible, can you help me understand some of these things? Like, I get it with my head, but not with my heart. I get that Jesus died for sinners, like that they said that he did, but I mean, do I really believe that? And God, can you help me believe and understand that he loves me? And so it was my second year in college when I eventually prayed to receive Christ as my Lord and Savior. It was at Riverbend Retreat Center, and immediately after that, I began growing in my faith. I met with someone a little bit older than me, and she helped me grow in understanding how to read the Bible. I remember when she first talked to me about baptism, I was like, I have no idea what that is, but I eventually got baptized, and my whole family was there, and a lot of my friends from the BSM were there. And then I graduated, and immediately after graduating, I started serving here at the BSM, and I've been here since. And so for me, it's been 7 years here, and my focus in ministry here is equipping y'all with understanding how to share your faith. So equipping students in the area of evangelism, follow-up, and discipleship. And so if that's an area that you really want to grow in, Impact Training is designed to help you grow in that area. Every week we'll have a different training, a different teaching. Typically, they're pretty practical in nature. This is going to be the most practical one of the semester. In the fall, we have more of a focus on missions and understanding different worldviews. And then this spring, we'll have more of a focus on apologetics. How do we defend our faith based on things that we see around us, especially outside of even the Bible? And so we'll have different speakers coming in. A lot of them are PhD students or professors. They have different backgrounds, a lot more educated than I am. And so it's going to be a little bit more heady the rest of the semester, but it should be pretty practical. When I talk to them, we try to make sure it's really practical for you to use skills and tools that they can equip you with as well. But I work here full time, and so for the rest of the spring semester, if you're interested in learning more about how to share your faith, whether it's contact evangelism, whether you're sharing your faith with people you have just met on campus, or you're trying to share with groups of friends, all of y'all have your own circles of influences, your own niches. Some of y'all are on different parts of different athletic groups, different clubs, different majors. And so our goal is to equip you and train you to share your faith with people in your own circles of influences. On Fridays, when we go out and share our faith with people, it's going to look a little different. We're going to do more of a contact evangelism style, just because it's easy to do on a Friday. We meet together. We'll have training from 12 to 1, and then 1 o'clock we'll go out and we'll share our faith with people we've never met before. And so if this is your first time, that may sound intimidating. If it's your second, 10th time, it might still sound intimidating. But what I've learned is just the way to grow in sharing your faith is just by doing it. And so you can sit in this room all you want and learn all these different techniques and ways to share your faith. But if you're not just going out and doing it, then you're not really growing in that area. And so that is how I've gotten better at sharing my faith, is just going out and doing it. A little bit of backstory about how Impact Training got started. So it was when I was a student, probably about maybe 9 years ago. There was another peer of mine who realized, the BSM is really good at bringing a lot of people in. And so bringing a lot of Christians together, some non-Christians are coming and hanging out, but not every student, not a majority of our students feel super confident in sharing their faith with other people. And there wasn't a group that was going out onto campus and just sharing their faith. And so Nate Phillips decided to get a group of students together and just did this small, super simple training. We'd watch different videos on YouTube, and we'd discuss different styles of training, and then maybe some of the students will come up and we'll just share different ways that we're sharing our faith. And so it started super just simple, grassroots, but it was really cool to just see a student see that there was a need on campus for training students to share their faith. And so that's how it all got started. And then ever since then, we've just continued running this program every week. And so this is a place for y'all to just learn how to share the gospel with anyone, anywhere, anytime, any place. Today we're going to talk about just 3 different ways that you can initiate and start conversations. And then we'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll learn a practical tool to help you share the gospel with someone. So, yeah. Does everyone have a sheet with them? If you don't have a handout, just raise your hand. We'll have someone grab one for you. We'll pull out that handout, and we'll run through it. We'll go through a lot again. We'll have some time for Q&A, and so you can ask whatever questions you want to ask. You write your questions down. We'll be glad to answer them. And then Kyle Duncan will come up in a little bit and help me with a tool that's going to be really practical and helpful for y'all. So the first thing that we want to go over is we get to share the good news. We get to share the good news. It's a privilege, not just an obligation. It's a privilege, it's not just an obligation. This is something that we really need to overcome and realize. But a lot of us, when we think about sharing our faith, we're I don't know if I really want to do that. And it's I've got to do that, not I get to do that. But it's really a privilege that God has called us to be ambassadors, that He's called us to the ministry of sharing with other people, that God could have done anything to reconcile people back to Himself. God didn't even have to reconcile people back to Himself, but He wanted to use us in order to bring people to come to know Him and to be restored and have a relationship with Him. And so that's a responsibility that we have, but it's not just a responsibility, it's also a great privilege. And so I hope that when you wake up in the morning and you think about your friends who don't know Christ, you're not I've got to share my faith with them today, but that you're excited to do that because you realize that God has given you a great responsibility to do that. And again, it's a huge privilege to get to represent Christ. Share the gospel, not religion, morality, or experience. Share the gospel, not religion, morality, or experience. What do I mean by that? It's really easy to get into conversations where the main thing is not the main thing, where you sit down with someone and they might share with you oh, I'm Catholic, or I'm more charismatic, or I'm this or that. Just a denomination that maybe you're not familiar with or that you don't agree with. And you're focused on like, oh, okay, so you got baptized when you were a baby. And then you start talking about baptism for a long time versus getting baptized after deciding to follow Christ. Or maybe you think you have different views of what happens when you take communion. Just different theological views. We don't want to focus so much, especially in these conversations that we're having on Fridays, on those open-handed issues, on those secondary issues, but we really want to focus on the main thing. We want to focus on the gospel. We want to focus on the fact that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and resurrected for us, and that the only means of salvation is believing in Him and giving up our lives to Him. So that's what we want to focus in on. I just remember there's so many different things that will come up in conversations, and I think it's important to address those things and not look at them and say, well, that's dumb, I don't want to talk about that, and just move on to the gospel. Like, we want to be sensitive. If they really have questions that are important, say, like, that's a good question. I'd love to answer that. Right now, I'd like to focus on the gospel, but maybe we can meet up for coffee sometime, and we could talk about that later. And so it'd be good use of just follow-up, using that area as a follow-up. So make sure that we focus on the gospel, not religion, morality, or experience, especially when you share your testimony. That's something that you want to practice a lot, because there are so many different ways to share your story about how you came to know Christ, or your story about how God has worked in your life, and you want to focus on the gospel. So you don't want to like share your testimony and say, there was this one time when I wasn't a Christian, and then the pastor was calling people up, and I was super emotional. I started crying, and I just knew that I had to do something, and so I did it. I finally walked up to the stage, and my life was changed. I'm a different person now. And so you're sharing like this experience, but this person has no like real productive understanding of like, what does it mean to have your life changed by God? So yeah, you want to make sure that whatever you share with them, that you make sure that your focus is on the gospel. So when you share your testimony with someone, sometimes I do on purpose not share the gospel in my testimony because I'm waiting for another time to get to share that. I used to rock climb at Dino Rock here a lot, and there was like this coach, and I was like, ooh, I want to share like the gospel with him. And he's like coaching me, and then I just start sharing a little bit of my story of how I went to Thailand that summer on a mission trip. But I didn't share anything about Jesus then, because I wanted to leave a little bit for me to share at a later time. And so that, just have a plan. When you meet someone, when you're about to meet someone, have a plan of like, do I want to share the gospel now, or do I want to share it later? But in the end, what needs to be your filter is the gospel. You don't ever want to say this person's not interested because they weren't in awe of like my story, or they weren't like excited when I said I went on a mission trip to Thailand, or like my life was changed here or there. Like, you want to make sure that whoever your friend is, that you just eventually use the gospel as a filter, because you never know how that person will respond to Jesus unless you share about Jesus with them. Does that make sense? I've just heard a lot of people say like, yeah, I talked to them about faith and they're just not that interested. And I asked them like, what did y'all talk about? And they tell me what they talked about. And they never shared about how Jesus Christ died for them, was buried, rose from the dead, and that they can have a relationship with God as well. And so if you don't share that, if you don't offer that to someone, then you're missing out on the opportunity of them getting to respond to that. Does that make sense? Next point is many Christians are not Christians. Many Christians are not Christians. Help people discern where they stand. And so what do I mean by this? This is super important because we live in Texas. We live in the U.S. There are a lot of people who identify as Christians. So you can walk into the UC right now, and you can ask someone, what's your spiritual background? And I say, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, they're identifying with Christ. And then you ask a few more questions, and they don't even know what a Christian is. They're like, well, a Christian is someone whose parents went to church growing up. Or like, I went to church some growing up, but I don't really believe in God. It's like, well, that's not really, what a Christian is. And so I've made the mistake in the past This was back when Nate Phillips was leading, and we were just all exploring together different ways to start conversations and how to continue moving, navigating through spiritual conversations. But I remember walking up to a girl, super intimidated, and I just asked her, like, hey, we're just going around talking to people about faith, and do you mind if you have a few minutes? She said, oh, well, I'm a Christian. And I said, oh, okay, well, have a good day. And I walked away because I was super afraid of how to respond. I was like, well, she's a Christian, so she's fine. But I have no idea if she really knew Jesus Christ, if she was really saved or not. And so what I needed to do was just say, yeah, do you want to talk about that? And then sit down and ask her, what does that mean to you? And her answer could have been anything. And again, the gospel needs to be the filter. And so if I asked her, what does that mean? And she never shared the gospel with me, she never shared about what Jesus has done for us, or I never shared that with her, then we have no idea, like, what she really believes in. And I shared this story with my vertical group on Tuesday, but I still rock climb in the MAC, but it was a few years ago when I was rock climbing the MAC, and you meet all kinds of people, and they're wonderful, they're really great, but I met this one guy, and he was just, you know those people that you meet who have, like, really strong personalities, and you just kind of feel like you can't really, there's not a lot that you can say because you feel like they want to talk like the whole time, which is fine. I love listening to people, but I remember talking to this guy, and I was like, oh, I remember thinking, like, I kind of want to say something, like I want to invite him to at least a Bible study or something. But I didn't, but I did exchange Facebook with information with him. So we became friends on Facebook. I felt super convicted just a few days later. And I texted him, or Facebook messaged him, and I said, hey, would you like to come to Vertical? And he said, F word, I left my Bible at home. I was like, oh, okay, well, and I just wanted to point out to him, like, non-Christians can come too. I kind of want him to see, like, that maybe, I don't think he's a Christian, but non-Christians can come, like, everyone's welcome, invited. So I said, yeah, that's okay, and, like, anyone's welcome, non-Christians are invited. He's like, oh no, I'm a Christian. And I was like, okay. And I knew in my mind, not every Christian is a Christian, so not everyone who calls himself a Christian is a Christian. And he wasn't able to make it, but I said, hey, I'd love to share my story about how I came to know Christ with you. Do you have time tomorrow? And he said, sure. And so we met right over here where the couches are. It was me, him, and another guy. And I got to share my story with him. And then I asked him, can I share the gospel with you? And I shared with him. And he prayed to receive Christ right there. And so I could have stopped it out when he said, well, I'm a Christian. I was like, oh, okay. Well, you can come to Bible study anytime. But there were, like, some clues, like, okay, he's, like, cussing after we just talked about the Bible, which I know people cuss, but I was like, maybe he's not a Christian. But I wanted the gospel to be the filter, not the fact that he just called himself a Christian to be the filter. And now he got baptized in a local church that a few of y'all are a part of. He's a professor here on campus. And it's just really cool to see him growing in his faith, and just to see God humble me and just to remind me, Putti, like, don't, like, judge the seed before you share the gospel with them. Like, make sure that you sow seeds broadly, that you share the gospel with people, and you let the gospel be the filter, and not just your, what you see of people be the filter. So be non-discriminate with how you share the gospel with people. The next point is God saves people, we don't save people. God saves people, we don't save people. And so it's important that we pray. So if there's anything that you take from today, I really hope that it's that when we share with people and we leave the conversation and someone decides to not follow Christ, it's not like you didn't fail or anything. Like, if you are sharing the gospel through the power of the Holy Spirit and you're leaving the results up to God, then you're doing what God has called you to do. If someone decides to follow Jesus or does not decide to follow Jesus, has nothing to do with you. It's God who saves. But God has called us to a responsibility in this salvation plan, that he has called us to be the ones to share this message with them. But whether or not they decide to follow Jesus, it's between them and God. And so we want to pray and ask God that he would lead us, that he would guide us, that he would give us creativity to know when to bring things up with people, gave us creativity to know when to gather friends to like maybe share a testimony with friends, or maybe start a Bible study with friends. We want to be praying that it's the Holy Spirit leading and guiding us to the right people and leading and guiding them to Christ. So super duper important. And you'll see that when we go out for evangelism at 1 o'clock, is we always circle up and we pray together, and then we go out 2 by 2 and we're praying as we go. But we don't want to do anything out of the power of our own power, but we want to make sure that we are grounded in the power of Christ as we share with people. The next point is always work to follow up, have a predetermined plan. Always work to follow up and have a plan. Super important. As y'all go, maybe some of y'all are done with classes today, but as you go to your classes, just be thinking about that. There are people in your classes that you're going to sit next to, and you can have like a follow-up plan with them. Like think in your mind like, hey, I'm going to sit by this girl or this guy, and we talk all the time, but maybe I should say, hey, you want to get some coffee sometime? Or like notice he's in workout clothes and say, do you work out? Like I work out too. Are you working out right after this? And then talk about it, like just have some sort of plan where you're trying to follow up with these people. Because the reality is when you're in the middle of something, the professor's going to stand up there and start talking. You might not have a really productive conversation. And so it might be fun to like share that like little testimony where you don't share a lot, but you share a little bit to at least establish yourself as a Christian, for them to realize, okay, like this person's a Christian. And like I could maybe ask this person questions later. Or it gives you like you're able to easily invite them to something like Vertical or Noondays, something at the VSM later, to your local church. But always work to follow up and have a plan, especially when you have conversations with people. And so today we're going to go out, and as we have conversations with people, there have been many who have said they're not yet ready to follow Christ, but they love to meet together to study the Bible. And that's just a really neat opportunity for you to just help them grow and understand the Bible, help them grow and take their next steps closer to Christ. And so even if someone's not interested, follow up with them, or is not yet ready to follow Christ, follow with them, and have a plan of how to do that. So Facebook, Instagram, or phone numbers. Students are, they're a lot more open than we think they are. And so we kind of look at the campus and we're like, I don't know if these people are really open to talking with me. But more times than not, the students are super open to having a conversation. And the worst that they could ever do is say no to you. They're hardly ever gonna like punch you in the face or anything. Like, so I don't know why we're so scared to like ask someone like, hey, do you mind if I like talk to you about my faith? And we just think it's like the most terrifying thing in the world, but the worst thing that can happen is they say no. And that's okay, because again, we ask that God would lead and guide us to the people that he wants us to speak to. And that might be him saying like, hey, there's another person over there that I want you to speak with. Or he may be wanting you to be more persistent with that person. And I'll give another story later on that. So always work to follow up. Next point is always initiate conversations that are respectful, upfront, and permission-based. So always initiate conversations that are respectful, upfront, and permission-based. So we don't do a lot of like standing, and I don't see that a lot, but I hear about it. But people like standing in the corners, like yelling, and sharing the gospel that way. We don't just walk up to someone and say, hey, I'm going to share the gospel with you, and start sharing with them. We try to be really respectful. And we smile and we ask them, is it okay if we share with you? If they say no, we move on. And if they say yes, we sit down with them and we talk with them. And so, yeah, this is what we call permission-based evangelism. And we're clear and upfront. So we're not like, in the past I remember walking with Nate. And so Nate's the guy who started this Bible study. And we just tried whatever. We just tried so many different things. And I remember there's like a table of like 4 girls in the UC. And Nate and I just walked up. He's like, do you want to talk to these ladies? I said, yeah, sure. And so he said, okay, cool. I'll initiate the conversation. I was like, all right, good. And so Nate goes, hey, ladies, can we sit with you? I was like, that was so awkward, and it took us so long to get to the gospel. But I really respected Nate because I knew his heart. His heart was to share the gospel with these people. We were just trying to figure out what was the best way to do it. And so now we just go up to people and say, hey, we're just going out, and we do this about once a week, and we're asking people questions about their faith. Would you happen to have a few minutes? Super clear, super upfront. We don't have to not be upfront. We can be upfront with them. So you get to the gospel by being salty. So what we're about to go through is an acronym and a tool that has been really helpful with us understanding how to navigate through these conversations. SALTY stands for start conversations, ask questions, listen, tell the gospel. We used to stop there in our training, but we realized that this last part is super duper important and is like vital in our trainings now, is why, yes or no, helping people discern where they stand. So we want them to say yes or no to deciding to follow Jesus, and for them to understand what that means. We don't stop at just sharing the gospel, but we want to ask them, would you like to have a relationship with God? And the more that we started asking that question, the more we started seeing people responding, yes, I do want to follow God, and growing in community with other Christians. Okay, so starting off with S, there are 3 different ways. I mean, there's so many different ways to start conversations with people, but the 3 that we'll talk about today are contact evangelism, casual conversations, and gospel appointments. Contact evangelism, casual conversations, and gospel appointments. So contact evangelism is just going up to strangers and then asking them if they'd like to have a conversation about Christ. And so, hi, my name is Putti, and this is Jared, and we're just going around asking people questions about their faith. Do you have a minute to talk? Super simple. And then a casual conversation could be like the conversation that I had with a guy at the rock wall, or that you have with someone who's sitting right next to you at Starbucks. I've started a conversation with a lady at Walmart who, in the grocery section, because I had like a class with her, and then I was like, oh, I've never shared with her. And then she was just talking to me for a while, and I just really felt like the Holy Spirit was like, Putti, you need to share with her. And I was like, I'm so afraid, I'm just holding spinach here. But it was just really cool that she did eventually pray to receive Christ. She was a little older than me, so I had another like older friend meet with her. Which is really cool. But casual conversation could be something as simple as this. Hey, I never asked you this before, but what's your spiritual background? Sometimes we're like, what bridge do I need to get to spiritual conversations? And we're thinking about all these like bridges, like all these different things that we can ask before we ask the question. But what we really need to do is just ask the question. It's a pretty like simple, like, I don't think anyone warms up from the receiving end that much more to you talking about spiritual things and you just asking them. And so I can't think of the biggest warm-up than you saying like, hey, I've never asked you this before, but I've been so curious, like, what is your spiritual background? So just asking them that. So what is the icebreaker is just asking them, what is your spiritual background? And then the last one, one of our favorites, is just gospel appointments. And so this is setting up appointments with friends that you know or people that you have just met. And so it might not be the time or place to have a conversation with them right then and there, but you want to set up an appointment with them. So you can do this by texting someone or just telling them there that you want to have a meeting with them. So something like, hey, I've been wanting to hear more about your spiritual background and share my story about how I came to know God. Do you have enough time this week? And so it's kind of like what I did with my friend Sean over Facebook Messenger, the rock climber. I just said, hey, do you happen to have time sometime this week? I'd love to share with you. And then shared with them the next day. Just setting up a time to share with them. And so contact evangelism, casual conversation, and gospel appointments. Next, we're moving on to ask questions. And so you could be one to start a conversation and just jump right into the gospel, but I think it's really helpful to ask some questions before you get there. And that is just a part of warming up to them, just kind of building a little bit of trust. Obviously, you can just share the gospel with someone, that's totally fine, but I found it really effective to just get to know them, especially if you don't really know them, and then ask some questions that are helpful with them discerning where they stand before God, and then sharing the gospel. And so I've heard this, I don't remember who said this to me before, but I've heard someone like say that we're like doctors of the soul. Like, when have you ever gone to the doctor and before they ever saw you or heard anything about you, just gave you medicine? Like, here's your medicine. You're like, even ask me, like, what's wrong with me? Like, this is weird. Like, what kind of medicine is this? Or like someone walks out to you on the street and says, here, I have a cure for you. And you're like, I don't even know what's wrong with me. But they think something's wrong with me. In some ways, when we just share the gospel with someone very quickly, they might not realize that they needed the gospel. And so some of these questions I felt has helped someone understand their need for Jesus. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so I like to use like the 80-20 rule. Sometimes we get intimidated by the idea of sharing the gospel with our friends because we think we need to talk the whole time. We need to know exactly what to say. But I like to think of it as 80% of the time they're talking and 20% of the time I'm talking. And my goal is just to ask really good, helpful questions. Not so much for me to get a lot out of their answers, but for them to hear for themselves. Matthew 15:18 says, but the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. And so that's something key that I like for them to notice. It's Matthew 15:18. But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. And so as I'm asking them these questions, they may realize I have not said anything about Jesus. Like when I ask them questions about like, yeah, what's your spiritual background? What do you believe in? If you're a day-to-day stand before God, do you think you get into heaven? Why or why not? And they're sharing all these things with me, and they never say anything about Jesus. Could be maybe telling about what they believe about God or don't believe about Jesus. So a few questions. The first is use fire to get started. And so find common ground, common interests, relationships, experience with spiritual things. And so you can ask them, what is your major? What year are you? Do you live on campus? What organizations are you a part of? And this is you just getting to know this person better. And then start asking them about their questions with spiritual things and their experience in it. So the first question I like to ask is, what is your spiritual background? I like that better than like, what do you believe in? Because their background has a lot to do with what they believe in today. And so it's really interesting to hear someone say, well, I'm a Christian. And then I ask, what is your background? And they share all this stuff about, well, my mom used to go to a Catholic church, and then my dad is an atheist, and then we stopped going to church. And I actually don't go anymore, and I don't believe in God. It's like, well, I don't know if you're really a Christian. And so I think it's really helpful for them, not just you, but for them to hear what their background is and how that has helped them guide them in their journey. And so what is your spiritual background? What did that look like growing up? What does it look like now? And that could help them just have insight. A lot of people have just never asked anyone these questions before, and that just gives them insight into knowing how their background has helped shape them into what they believe today. Sometimes I ask them, like, do you have siblings? Like, what is their relationship with God like? If someone were to ask me that when I was a student, it would be like it would be the first time ever that anyone would have ever asked me that. Like, no one asked me that in high school. And then as I thought I would think about it more, I'd realize, like, you know what? I don't think my brother and I ever talked about God. It was never something super important to us. And that could be helpful for me to get and understand that spiritual things might seem strange to me right now just because we never talked about it growing up, versus it's strange to me because I really can't believe in it. Does that make sense? And so that could be helpful for them. So what was your spiritual background? What did that look like growing up? Number two and 4 are basically asking the same thing. They can ask it in 2 different ways if the person doesn't understand it. What do you think it takes to get to heaven? How sure are you on the percentage that you get to heaven? Or suppose you were to stand before God today and he asked you, why should I let you into heaven? What would you say to him? So do you think you get into heaven? Why or why not? And the point of these questions, I like to think BGG, background, grace, and God. What is their background? What is their view of God's grace? And the number one question that I think to ask when I'm trying to understand, like, how do they understand God's grace is their view of, like, what it takes to get to heaven, what it takes to have eternal life, what it takes to be with God forever. So whatever question that you can ask to help them see that. And then the last question is getting us to the gospel, getting us to things about God. So, do you know what the gospel is? Can I share it with you in about 4 to 5 minutes? Awesome. And then the next point is listen. Super simple, but super key is that we want to be really good listeners as we meet with our friends. And so whether or not we're having spiritual conversations with them, when they're in classes or when we're studying with them, when they're around us, just be listening for key things and maybe using those as opportunities to bring things up later. And say like, hey, Stacy, I heard you say something about, whatever, like church. I became curious about like what your church background is. Would you like to get together sometime for coffee and we can talk about it? And so just be listening well, but even in those conversations, listening really well and bringing things up that may come up later. And again, a lot of this is for them to say out of their mouths and hear for themselves. And that's why I think it's really important for us to ask good questions, not solely for us to do anything with the answers. So you don't need to feel like intimidated, like, ooh, they're giving me a lot of answers, I need to do something with this. But it's more for them to hear for themselves, and I think that's really powerful. Because when you ask them that next question, do you know what the gospel is? Do you mind if I share that with you? It's basically a summary of how we can have a relationship with God. After you ask them all of those questions, they're like so ready for you to like share something now. And then they may realize when you share the gospel with them that they never said anything about Jesus the whole time in their testimony. And that could be really powerful and helpful for someone, especially with a Christian background, who realize even though I grew up in church, I never gave up my life to Christ. So, the next point is T, tell. Tell them the good news about Jesus. Tell them good news about Jesus. And again, we're asking them a few questions, and then now how do we get to the gospel? How do we turn it over to our part where we're sharing the gospel with them? And so you basically just ask them, can I share with you an illustration that helped me know God better? And if you already set up an appointment with them, or you ask them, do you mind if we meet and talk about spiritual things, they expect that you're going to share something with them. So it's usually not difficult to get there. And now I'm going to call Kyle up. And Kyle's going to share an illustration with us that's really helpful. Once we get to this part, we want to share the gospel with them. There's so many different ways to do this. Some of y'all have maybe heard of the bridge illustration, 3 circles, knowing God personally booklets. Maybe you've never seen an illustration. I think illustrations are super duper important. Whether or not you feel really confident, and you're like, oh, I don't need an illustration to share the gospel. I can just share it, out of my mouth, and we can have a good conversation. I think it's really helpful for the other person to have a visual and have something that they could take with them and walk away with. But one of my friends, Andy, he was like the first person to share the gospel with me. His father came to know Christ in college, and someone shared a booklet with him. And then he threw it behind his bed in his dorm. And then a little bit later, he's like, wait, where's that booklet? I think I'm ready to become a Christian. But he didn't know how. And so he pulled out the booklet, and then he prayed the example of prayer, and he prayed to receive Christ. And now is a church planner, and his sons are church planners and missionaries across the world in the U.S. It's really cool story. But yeah, same with our friends. We may share with them, and the conversation is so long, and there's so many questions. But it's really cool for them to get to leave with something in their hands. So whether it's a booklet or an illustration, and that's why we want to turn to this illustration. And then before Kyle's about to share, the last point is why, yes or no. This is super important. Something to remember is that lost people do not know how to be saved. So that's something that we take for granted. We share the gospel with them. We look at each other and we're like, yeah, my friend's not ready yet? You didn't pray to receive Christ? And then you might want to ask your friends, okay, did you ask him if he or she is ready to receive Christ? No, I didn't. And so we expect that lost people know exactly what to do after we share the gospel with them. But the truth is that they don't know what to do. That a lot of them will hear it and they're moved by it, but they need help for you to lead and guide them and help them understand what to do next. And so Kyle's going to share an illustration that shares the gospel, and then shares with them how they can respond to the gospel as well. May y'all welcome Kyle.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm really encouraged just by all the new faces that are in the room. That's really cool to see. Just some people that are eager to share their faith and want to learn how to do that. And so, like Putti said, this is just a really simple tool that we use quite a lot here at the BSM. So we'll run through it. I think we're going to role play a little bit. So Putti will be the non-believer, and I'll be the BSM intern on campus. Ben, do you want me to hold the mic, or? Great. Okay, sweet. And we're just muting in music.
Cool.
Hi, Putti. What's up?
Good.
How's it going?
I'm good. Thank you.
Sweet. I thought we were going to be the first time, but we've already met. So, how was class today?
It was so good. Thanks.
Cool. What did you do in class?
Oh, I just napped.
Oh. Cool. Yeah, same. I don't have no idea what he said, but cool. Well, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Hey, I know that we've talked a couple times, but I've never really gotten to share like the most important thing in my life to you, and that's Jesus. Do you mind if I just share with you the story of Jesus for like 4 minutes? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Sweet. Okay. Cool. I'll use this whiteboard here. So, okay. So we live in a broken world. And this line is going to represent that brokenness. And so what I mean by that, Putti, is that it doesn't take me long to look around this world and see that things are not really perfect. So I can turn on the news any time of the day and see that there's death and sickness and poverty and war and just all kinds of stuff. I can see it in my family when they disagree with each other, and I can even see it in myself when I get lonely or sad or anything like that. But that wasn't how God originally intended the world to be. So God intended the world to be perfect, so that we could have a perfect relationship with Him. But we disobeyed God, and we went against His design, we went against His will, and the Bible calls this sin. And sin is basically kind of how I say it in my head, anything that we say or do or think that goes against God. And so we sinned against God, we went against Him, and because of that, our relationship with God was broken. And now we're in this brokenness. And we try to fix ourselves or satisfy ourselves or escape this brokenness through a lot of different ways. And so some could be, I'm trying to get a really good job and be really successful. I'm trying to have a lot of money. I'm trying to be really famous. It could be kind of good things, like so I'm trying to just be a good person. I'm trying to pray as often as I can. Maybe I go to church every once in a while. Could be kind of bad things that I try to fulfill myself with, like maybe I turn to drugs or alcohol or some kind of other thing. And I could really go on for a long time about the things that we try to do to fulfill ourselves or get out of this brokenness. And so the beautiful part of the story of Jesus is that God saw that we were kind of stuck in here and that all these things were never going to satisfy us forever or get us out of this brokenness ultimately. And so Jesus saw that, and He loved us so much that He came down to this earth and lived a perfect life. So a life without sin and a life without messing up, and then died on the cross for our sin. So again, we had disobeyed God, and so we deserved punishment for that. And Jesus took that punishment for us and paid for our sin. And not only did He do that, but He rose from the grave on the third day and conquered sin and conquered death. And so Jesus has provided us this way out of this brokenness, this way to fulfill ourselves forever, this way to know Him forever. And He says that we can do this and enter this back into this relationship with Him through three things. And we call them the ABCs. And so the first one is to admit. And so admit just means that understanding that I'm not perfect, that I have messed up, that I have sinned against God, and that I do need Him. And then the second one is to believe. So to believe this message, to believe that God really did love me enough to come down to this world and live a perfect life and die on the cross for my sin and then rise from the grave. And then the third one is to commit. And so because Jesus has done all these things for me and has loved me so much, I want to give my life to him. And I want to say, Jesus, I want to follow you, because obviously you long for a relationship with me if you're going to do all this for me. And so he says that if we do these three things, that we can enter back into a relationship with him and be restored to him. And so, Putti, there's really two different types of lives left. And so I'm going to draw these two circles right here. And these are going to represent those two different types of lives. And then I'm going to draw these thrones right here. They're kind of like chairs, but they're thrones. So the first life is a life where Jesus, it's going to be this cross right here, is really on the outside. So maybe you think about him every once in a while. Maybe you pray every once in a while. Maybe you don't believe in him at all. But definitely Jesus isn't like a huge part of your life. And so that's one type of life. And then the second type of life is where Jesus is on the throne of your life, and Jesus is in control. And you have admitted and believed and committed and said, I want to make you Lord of my life, and I want you to be in charge. So, Putti, I know that we've talked about a lot, but which circle do you think describes your life right now?
Definitely this one.
Okay, that one. Okay, why do you say that?
Because I'm an atheist.
Okay, gotcha. Which circle do you want to be in?
I think this is really cool. I've never heard this before, and I just love the idea of having Jesus on the center of my life.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool to hear that. Do you want to, so, I don't know if you can do this, but you can do that right now. That you can pray to receive Jesus right now, and you can make him Lord of your life. Is that something that you want to do?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, what we can do is, all we have to do is talk to God, and that's just what prayer is. And so we can tell Jesus, like, that Putti wants to be a part of your family and wants to know you and wants to know you personally. And so I can either pray first, then you follow me, or you can just pray out loud and I'll pray after you.
Okay.
Sound good?
Cool.
Cool?
Yay.
All right, let's pray. Okay.
Oh, yeah!
So, thank you, Kyle.
What questions do y'all have about that illustration, or just anything that we talked about?
So in sharing the gospel, what are some like red flags that someone's like trying to argue with you and like that you should kind of just back off and like walk away from it?
That's a good question. What are some red flags of someone who's, it's not really interested in conversation, is just wanting to argue? I mean, if they're like yelling, I mean, it's really rare to get this. But you can just say, thank you so much for your time. Have a good day, and you can invite them to vertical or something. You can just kind of leave it as it is. But it's rare for someone to get super argumentative, but it may happen, and you just need to leave the conversation. Yeah, it's good. What other questions do y'all have?
I guess I'll follow up on that a little bit. It's maybe be familiar with some of the internet kind of arguments against Christianity, like oh, the Bible's just a bunch of fairy tales, you're a fool for believing it. Because when people start talking in those terms and start saying, oh, just kind of be braiding scripture, that can be a red flag that they may not be a good person to talk to, and maybe keep trying for a second, but like if it kind of keep that antagonistic mindset, that can be a sign to say, all right, thanks, have a good day. When I was a student, I had a guy yell at me about how Noah's Ark could never happen, it's just a children's story, and I'm a fool for believing it. I was a freshman at that time, and that was my first time on campus. All right, but the next day I saw him, and he was like kind of sheepish, and he apologized, and we had a good conversation, and we're still friends to this day. But that day I was like, see ya.
You don't need to feel like you have to answer all of their questions. And I think people really respect, if they ask you a difficult question, say, that's a really good question. I'll have to think about that and I can get back to you. I think they really respect it. I think they don't like it when you try to answer it, you actually have no idea what you're talking about. So you don't have to do that. You don't owe anyone anything in these conversations. That's another question that I'll have.
What if they say that they're neither of the circles?
What if they say they're neither of these circles? Someone here want to respond to that? So you ask them, are you in this circle or that circle?
You could maybe go a little bit deeper into what each circle means. And Putti actually shared with me one time when I was talking with a friend. So the circle on the left, that person, and she kind of touched on, or Kyle kind of touched on it. That person, they could very well go to church. They could pray or read the Bible, and think, well, he's not on the throne of my life because I haven't admitted and believed and I don't follow him, but I go to church and so I don't really know where I stand. So maybe go into a little bit deeper. The person on the left, they might very well go to church, read their Bible, pray, all those things, but the main thing is they don't, like, Jesus is not on the throne of their heart, and they're not following him in their life. They haven't admitted, and they're not committed to following Jesus. And really emphasize maybe, or go into a little bit deeper into what it is. And so that would be a situation of, in that case, but
Yeah, that's really good. I think the biggest thing is to contrast it with this one. Like, just saying, so this is a person who has decided that they have followed Jesus Christ, that they know that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior of their life, and this is everyone else. So we put the cross on the outside just because maybe there's some Christian influence there, but they haven't given up their life to Christ. So just always contrasting with this. So we're either saved or not saved. We either have a relationship with God or we don't. There's no middle ground. And so a lot of people say, I'm in the middle. You ask them, what do you mean by that? It's like, well, I feel like we're getting there. And it's like, when we stand before God, we're not like almost there. We either have a relationship with him or we don't. And that's why there's such an urgency to respond to him and to take it seriously. We want to take time, but to realize, like, we don't know what can happen tomorrow or the next day. We want to make sure that we really consider who Christ is and is, like, worth it to follow him. And yeah, obviously it is. What else? I've had people ask me before, like, so for the question, if you're a die-to-day, stand before God, do you think you get to heaven? Why or why not? What if someone doesn't believe in heaven? I still ask them, so I understand if you don't believe in heaven, but if there is one, do you think you get there? Why or why not? Most people, about 90-something% of people's responses has always been, yeah, I think I get there, or like, yeah, I think, because they think they're good enough, they're like, I don't think I'm that bad of a person, so I think I get into heaven. And so the point is, in that question, is for them to see, is their view of their relationship with God's works-based, or is it grace-based? Is it based on their works and their merits and them earning their way to salvation? Or did they realize that there's nothing they could ever do to earn or merit God's salvation? They've sinned against him, but the only thing that could ever pay the price of our sin is Jesus Christ dying on the cross for us. And so it's either that or something else. And so when we ask that question, if you're a die-to-day stand before God, do you think you're getting to heaven? Why or why not? It's for them to hear for themselves, yeah, I think so because I'm working hard towards it. Or I don't think so because I haven't worked very hard towards it. And then when you share the gospel with them, this illuminates so much more when they're like, whoa, like, I didn't realize, like, I totally identify with this. I'm like trying really hard. I'm trying to cover up my sin. I'm doing all these things, but it's only through Jesus that I can come to salvation. And so that was the point of that question. And if someone says, I don't believe in heaven or hell, just ask them, if heaven and hell were a real thing, do you think you get there? Why or why not? Because even if they don't believe in heaven or hell, their mind is set on works-based things. And what's beautiful about the gospel is that there's nothing you and I could ever do to earn salvation, that Jesus Christ has done everything for us. So that was the point of that question. What are some other questions? How many of y'all are seeing the 3 circles for the first time, or haven't done the 3 circles before? I'm just curious. Haven't done the 3 circles. Y'all done the 3 circles? Okay, cool, awesome. So as we go out, something like this, like I've shared the gospel like so many times before I've ever touched 3 circles, before I've ever seen 3 circles, and it took me a little bit to get used to it. And so you might notice when you're trying to draw it, you're like, oh, you don't remember, everything on the 3 circles. Just like anything else, you get better at something by practicing. And if anything, like your goal again, when you're having these conversations with people, is to share the gospel, not just keep that in mind, but to also be practicing the 3 circles, because you do want to make sure that you are able to give an illustration and give it well to someone so that they can leave really understanding it and maybe able to share it with someone else. So, yeah. It is 1 o'clock right now, and so we're going to take like a bathroom water break for a few minutes, and then we'll circle it right over here, and then we'll pair up. If it's your first time going out, we'll pair you with someone experienced. Someone who's gone before, so don't be afraid. And yeah, we'll see you in a few minutes.
Just wanted to make sure.
Our 4th time doing this?
Yeah.